Ever wake up at 3 a.m., heart's kind of racing, wondering if, like, you've just stumbled into the twilight zone or something? You're definitely not alone. Today's deep dive is all about those, well, unsettling 3 a.m. wake-up calls. But instead of just blaming insomnia, we're going to explore the spiritual side of things. Think ancient wisdom meets personal experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting how many cultures actually view this hour, not with fear, but with like reverence.
Yeah.
3 a.m., it's not just dark and quiet. It's been considered a bridge between the physical and the spiritual for centuries.
Yeah.
A time when the veil between those worlds kind of thins out a little bit.
Okay, thin veils. That sounds a little bit like something straight out of a ghost hunting show, honestly. But what does that actually mean for those of us who aren't, actively trying to contact spirits at that hour?
Well, think of it less about ghosts and more about receptivity across so many different traditions, from Celtic lore to Taoist practices. 3 a.m. is when it was really seen as the time for rituals of divination and healing and even astral projection. The idea is that our logical minds are at rest, which allows for like these deeper parts of ourselves to come forward.
So if someone wakes up at 3 a.m. feeling unusually intuitive, or even just like connected to something bigger than themselves, that could be this thin veil phenomenon in action.
Precisely. And it doesn't have to be anything dramatic or super weird. It could be a sudden urge to meditate that you've never felt before, or a dream that feels incredibly vivid and meaningful. And all of this kind of ties into the whole concept of spiritual awakening,
Right.
which again isn't always some, lightning bolt moment. Often it's a very gradual shift in awareness that can actually begin with those quiet early hours.
Speaking of subtle shifts, one of the most common interpretations we found of 3 a.m. awakenings is angelic communication. Now, I gotta admit, I was a bit skeptical about this one at first. Angels sending us like urgent texts in the middle of the night.
Right.
It seems a tad inconvenient.
Well, it's less about texting and more about just tuning in. Think about it this way. If our minds are completely cluttered with like our daily worries and to-do lists, it's kind of like trying to have a conversation in a crowded room. But then at 3 a.m., when everything is quiet, there's this stillness that descends. That might actually allow for much subtler forms of communication to get through.
So what are some signs that someone might be receiving angelic guidance at this hour? And asking for a friend here who may or may not have woken up with the sudden urge to buy a ukulele at 3:03 a.m. last week.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
maybe the ukulele is a message in and of itself, but yeah.
In all seriousness, angelic communication is very often described as these gentle nudges rather than these, booming pronouncements from up high. So it could be a recurring dream or a feeling of just like this really profound peace during or after waking up, or even a song that gets stuck in your head. One with lyrics that feel surprisingly relevant to your life at that moment. That actually reminds me of something I read about Joan of Arc. Apparently, she started receiving guidance from the Archangel Michael when she was only 13 years old. And a lot of those experiences supposedly occurred during the early morning hours. Talk about an early riser, right?
Right. And her story just sort of highlights how these experiences have been documented, really, across cultures and time periods.
Right.
But, it's not always about just feeling good, right? Sometimes those 3 a.m. wake-up calls can be, well, can be a bit rough, emotionally speaking. And that's where another interpretation comes in.
Yeah.
One that delves into what you might call the shadow side of things.
Okay, shadow side at 3 a.m. You've officially piqued my curiosity. What's the thinking behind those less than pleasant awakenings?
Well, imagine this. All day long, we're busy doing our thing.
Right.
And a lot of that involves pushing down emotions, anxieties, unresolved issues, almost like we're just stuffing everything into a mental closet and hoping it doesn't explode.
Right.
But then comes 3 a.m., the quietest hour. And suddenly the door to that closet swings wide open.
And boom, we're just hit with this like wave of existential dread.
Well, not necessarily dread, but it's definitely true that our subconscious might use that time to bring unresolved pain or trauma to the surface. Think of it less as a curse and more as a strange opportunity for healing, I guess. Like our inner therapist is finally getting some uninterrupted time with us.
So those rough awakenings we're talking about, they're less about like something external haunting us.
Yeah.
And more about our internal world, doing a little bit of house cleaning at 3 a.m.
Exactly. And, it might not be pleasant in the moment, but it can be really productive in the long run. Think about traditional shamanic practices, for instance. A lot of those actually involve intentionally inducing these sorts of states, often in darkness, as a way to, confront fears and gain insight. So in a way, our 3 a.m. selves might be tapping into that very, very ancient wisdom.
Okay, that makes me feel a little bit better about my last 3 a.m. Closet cleaning session, which honestly mostly involved worrying about whether I was watering my plants too much. But hey, this deep dive is full of surprises. We've gone from thin veils to angels to shadow work. What else is there?
Well, if we're talking about confronting the unexpected, there's another interpretation of 3 a.m. that we came across that's less about introspection and more about external forces, specifically spiritual protection.
Wait a second. So instead of being like spiritually vulnerable at 3 a.m., we might actually be more spiritually shielded. That's a plot twist I did not see coming.
Yeah, a fascinating concept, right?
Mm.
A lot of traditions talk about guardians, whether it's ancestors or spirit guides or protective energies,
Yeah.
who are actually most active during this time. It's like a spiritual watch shift change, if you will.
Okay, so those unsettling feelings that some people report having at that hour, could it be that it's our guardians trying to, like, alert us to something? Not necessarily to scare us, but more to kind of, I don't know, protect us, like a cosmic security system going up in the middle of the night. Precisely.
Yeah.
And it really ties into this idea that energetically we are much more sensitive at 3 a.m. So it might be that our guardians find it easier to get our attention, to maybe nudge us towards a different course of action, or to just kind of like heighten our awareness of potential pitfalls.
Huh. Makes you wonder if all those stories about people sensing presences at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
or even having like
Yeah.
premonitions or whatever were really just messages from their protectors all along.
Right.
But let's shift gears for a second here, because we also came across this idea of 3 a.m. being a really, really prime time for connecting with our own intuition.
Yeah. And it's interesting you should mention that, because in a lot of ways, this particular interpretation kind of ties all the others together.
Okay.
Think about it. Whether we're talking about thin veils, angelic guidance, messages from our subconscious, all of these things involve tapping into something that lies beyond our, our everyday logical minds. So 3 a.m. isn't just about these external forces acting on us. It's also about accessing a deeper level of wisdom within ourselves. Okay? I like where this is going.
Exactly. The stillness of that hour allows for a totally different kind of clarity. It's like someone just hit the mute button on all the external noise, so you can finally actually hear the whispers of your own inner guidance.
That actually makes me think about all the, all the artists and inventors throughout history who've credited those early morning hours with their biggest creative breakthroughs. Maybe they weren't just sleep deprived. Maybe they were tapping into this this wellspring of creativity that's available to us at that hour.
Right.
So then what's the best way to harness that intuitive energy if and when it shows up at 3 a.m.?
I think the real key is to approach those moments with curiosity rather than fear. So instead of immediately trying to force yourself back to sleep, just take a few minutes to journal or meditate, or even just, sit quietly and reflect on any insights or gut feelings that might be coming up for you in those moments. You might be surprised by what emerges.
Yeah. It's like that saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. But this deep dive isn't over yet. We've got one final interpretation of 3 a.m. to explore, and this one might be the most practical one of all.
Oh, let's hear it. I'm ready for another perspective shift.
This one ties into something that, honestly, many spiritual traditions have emphasized for centuries, and that's the power of the early morning for prayer and meditation. So instead of hitting the snooze button at 3 a.m., we should be hitting our meditation cushions instead. I gotta say, I kind of like the sound of that.
Right, yeah. Well, it makes a lot of sense when you really think about the unique energy of those early hours. The world still feels, it feels still almost sacred. And it's definitely no coincidence that so many spiritual practices, from Sufi whirling to Christian monastic traditions, emphasize this very specific time for connecting with the divine.
It's like the universe is, I don't know, handing us this perfectly quiet moment, this chance to go inward before all the, the demands of daily life start creeping in.
Yeah.
But this begs the question, honestly. If someone wakes up at 3 a.m. and they're just not feeling particularly spiritual at that moment, are they doomed?
Not at all. It's not about forcing anything, right?
Okay.
Even just a few minutes of quiet reflection or journaling, or simply focusing on your breath can be a really, really powerful way to tap into that stillness. I think the key here is to approach those awakenings with an open mind and try to just listen to what your intuition might be trying to tell you.
Yeah. It's almost as if, our 3 a.m. selves, they're holding on to a piece of wisdom or something that our daytime selves we haven't quite grasped yet.
Right.
Well, we talked about so many intriguing interpretations tonight. Thin veils, angelic guidance, shadow work, spiritual protection, intuitive insights, and now
Yeah.
even prayer and meditation. It's a lot to process.
It is. But that's kind of the beauty of it, right? There's
Yeah.
no one right answer when it comes to this stuff. What really resonates for one person might be completely different for somebody else.
Yeah.
I think the real invitation here is for each of us to explore these different interpretations, pay attention to our own experiences,
Mhm.
and see what unfolds.
I love that. So the next time you find yourself staring at the clock at 3 a.m., instead of feeling frustrated or annoyed, maybe it's a chance to, I don't know, just listen a little deeper. What if? What if those wake-up calls, they aren't really random at all? What if they're actually like a tap on the shoulder from our higher selves or our intuition or maybe even something beyond ourselves entirely, just kind of inviting us to connect with a deeper part of who we are? Something tells me that's a deep dive worth taking.